The empty chamber was not wasted space. On the right revolver, it could be the chamber that kept the gun from firing when nobody pulled the trigger. That sounds backward. A man carrying a 6-shot revolver had already accepted the weight, the cost, and the responsibility of an armed life. Why would he voluntarily give up 1/6 of his ammunition? The familiar answer is that every careful gunfighter loaded 5 cartridges and lowered the hammer over the empty chamber. It is a sensible answer. It is also much tidier than the historical record. The revolver at the center of the claim is the Colt single-action Army. The United States Army adopted it in 1873, after trials held the year before. Colt built it around a cylinder with 6 chambers and a solid frame strong enough for a .45 caliber metallic cartridge. The standard cavalry version had a 7.5-inch barrel and weighed a little more than 2 pounds. It was a serious service weapon, not a pocket pistol dressed up for a photograph. William Mason and Charles Brinkerhoff Richards were the Colt engineers most closely connected to the design. Mason had worked on cartridge revolvers and conversion systems. Richards was a skilled engineer who later taught at Yale. Their work arrived more than a decade after Samuel Colt died in 1862, which matters because the famous Colt of the Old West was not personally designed by the company founder. His name stayed on the factory. Other men solved the later mechanical problems. Single action describes what happened before each shot. The hammer had to be pulled fully back by hand. That motion rotated the cylinder and placed a fresh chamber behind the barrel. Pulling the trigger then released the hammer. The trigger did one job, while the shooter's thumb did the other. This was different from a later double-action revolver, where a longer trigger pull could cock and release the hammer in one movement. The hammer itself had several positions. Fully down, its firing pin pointed through the rear of the frame toward the cartridge primer. Slightly back was the safety notch. Farther back was the half-cock position, used when the cylinder needed to turn for loading. Fully back was full cock, the firing position. Those 4 positions produced the famous clicks, but the sound was not the important part. The important part was where the firing pin sat in relation to a live primer. The chamber was one of 6 holes bored through the cylinder. A cartridge sat inside each loaded chamber with its primer facing backward. When the cylinder locked into position, one primer lined up with the hammer-mounted firing pin, while the bullet faced the barrel. The frame kept those parts aligned. That alignment made the revolver work reliably when fired on purpose. It also created the direct path that concerned careful owners when the hammer was fully lowered. The loading gate on the right side of the frame gave access to one chamber at a time. An ejector rod beneath the barrel pushed out empty cases after firing. These details separated the new cartridge Colt from the percussion revolvers that preceded it. The older guns were loaded from the front of the cylinder and used separate percussion caps at the rear. Calling both types 6-shooters is easy. Assuming they shared the same safety problem is not. That is why 6-shooter only describes capacity. It tells us the cylinder had 6 chambers. It does not tell us how many cartridges an owner carried on an ordinary day. It also tells us nothing about rifles, shotguns, derringers, later double-action handguns, or earlier cap and ball revolvers. A useful fact about one Colt pattern becomes nonsense when stretched over every gun seen west of the Mississippi. The risk began when 3 things lined up. The hammer was fully forward. The firing pin was directly behind a live primer. The gun then received enough force to drive one into the other. A cartridge primer contains a small impact-sensitive compound. When struck correctly, it ignites the powder charge inside the cartridge. During normal firing, the mainspring drives the hammer forward, the firing pin crushes the primer, and the cartridge fires. The safety concern was that a hard external blow could send energy through the same path without a deliberate pull of the trigger. That did not mean every dropped Colt fired. It did not mean a revolver would discharge whenever it touched the ground. The angle, the force, the condition of the parts, and the exact position of the hammer all mattered. The problem was possibility, not certainty. A rider could be thrown from a horse. A holstered revolver could strike a saddle horn. A wagon could overturn. A gun could fall from a bunk, a table, or a belt. Most such events would end with damaged pride and some dust. The bad version ended with the firing pin striking a live primer. Horseback carry made the question more practical than it looks in a display case. A cavalry holster had a flap, partly because leather could help keep the revolver inside, and shield the hammer from weather and contact. Civilian holsters varied widely. A man climbing through a fence, sleeping in a bunkhouse, lifting freight, or repairing tack could expose the gun to impacts that had nothing to do with a gunfight. The revolver was most likely to be struck when its owner was doing something ordinary and inconvenient. The safety notch was meant to prevent that direct contact. When the hammer caught securely in the notch, the firing pin stood away from the primer. On a clean, properly fitted revolver, that gave the owner a designed carrying position. The United States Army did not issue a weapon and simply hope everyone avoided gravity. The notch was part of the intended system. But the notch was a small mechanical engagement between the trigger sear and the hammer. Wear mattered. Poor repair mattered. A chipped edge, a weak spring, a broken part, or a hard blow could change a reassuring click into very little protection. A revolver carried for years on horseback, exposed to dust, sweat, rain, and improvised repair, did not live the same life as a new revolver inspected at a government arsenal. There were therefore 3 different conditions. Hammer fully down on a live cartridge, which placed the firing pin against or very near the primer. Hammer held in the safety notch, which depended on the notch and related parts remaining sound. Hammer fully down over an empty chamber, which removed the primer from the path entirely. The third condition did not make the entire gun harmless, but it eliminated this specific chain of contact. That is the mechanical case for 5 cartridges. It is strong. The empty chamber cannot have a defective primer because it has no primer at all. It does not depend on a tiny notch surviving a fall. For a civilian who might carry a revolver hundreds of hours and fire it for only a few seconds, surrendering 1 shot could look reasonable. Then the official manual enters the story and ruins the clean version. In 1874, the National Armory at Springfield published Description and Rules for the Management of the Springfield Rifle, Carbine, and Army Revolvers, Caliber 45. The work was associated with James Gilchrist Benton, an Army Ordnance Officer, and Lieutenant Henry Metcalf, who handled much of the revision. The manual described the new service arms, their ammunition, their parts, and the way soldiers were expected to manage them. Its instruction for the Colt revolver did not say to leave 1 chamber empty. It told the soldier to insert the cartridges, close the gate, and, in its short key line, bring the hammer to the safety notch and keep it there until the pistol was to be fired. The wording assumes a fully loaded cylinder. There is no step telling the soldier to stop after 5. There is no empty chamber placed beneath the hammer. The Army accepted the mechanical safety notch as the normal carrying solution. That is not a later opinion from a gun magazine. It is the intended military procedure published 1 year after the Colt entered service. The first Army order covered 8,000 revolvers, priced at $13.30 each. Government inspectors checked military Colts at the factory, and men such as Orville Wood Ainsworth placed inspection marks on early examples. The standard cavalry revolver had a 7.5-inch barrel, and the Army paired it with a flap holster and issued ammunition. The system was designed around uniform equipment and repeated drill. An Army revolver also existed inside a structure of scheduled maintenance, armorers, replacement parts, and formal inspection. A damaged notch could be reported. A weak spring could be replaced. A revolver that failed inspection could be removed from service. The system was imperfect, but it was more organized than 1 ranch hand, 1 screwdriver, and a strong belief that the spring probably had another year left in it. Civilian conditions could run in the opposite direction. A revolver might be bought used, carried for a decade, repaired with mismatched parts, or passed from 1 owner to another without any written record. A lawman in a busy town might inspect his weapon carefully. A farmhand might not. The category civilian is too broad to supply 1 behavior. This distinction matters. The manual proves what the Army expected. It does not prove what every soldier did after months in the field. It proves even less about cowboys, town marshals, stage guards, gamblers, farmers, and outlaws who bought second-hand revolvers and maintained them however they could. Official procedure and daily behavior are related, but they are not identical. Anyone who has ever read a workplace manual already understands that gap. The contradiction changes the question. Mechanically, 5 is safer against a blow to the hammer. Historically, the Army instructed 6 with the hammer held in the safety notch, So the real investigation is not whether the empty chamber works. It does. The harder question is when armed civilians began using it, often enough for later writers to treat it as an old universal rule. The answer cannot be found by looking at the Colt alone, because the Colt single-action army was only one branch of a much larger revolver family. Before metallic cartridges became standard, Samuel Colt's company sold cap and ball revolvers. The Colt Model 1851 Navy entered production around 1850 and became one of the most popular percussion revolvers of its era. It used a 6-chamber cylinder in .36 caliber. The Colt Model 1860 Army was larger, 6-shot and .44 caliber. More than 200,000 Model 1860 revolvers were produced from 1860 through 1873. These revolvers did not hold self-contained cartridges. Each chamber received loose powder and a projectile from the front, while a percussion cap sat on a nipple at the rear. Colt cylinders commonly included small safety pins between the chambers. The hammer could rest on a pin instead of resting on a cap. The principle was straightforward. Keep the hammer away from the ignition point, but do it between loaded chambers rather than over an empty one. That arrangement also explains why habits did not transfer neatly from one generation of guns to the next. A man familiar with a cap and ball Colt could load all 6 chambers and place the hammer between them on a safety pin. When he later acquired a cartridge Colt, the cylinder no longer offered the same pins. The new hammer had a safety notch instead. He might trust the new feature, follow printed instructions, or decide that an empty chamber was the better substitute. The records do not let us count those decisions. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West preserves a Colt Navy connected to James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill Hickok. The museum can identify the model, the caliber, the engraving, and the chain of ownership. It cannot look backward through the steel and tell us how many chambers Hickok loaded on an ordinary morning. Even a famous surviving gun gives solid evidence about the object and weak evidence about a daily habit. Remington followed a different line. Its new model Army percussion revolver used safety slots between chambers on later cylinders. The hammer could be lowered into one of those slots, again keeping it away from a live percussion cap. When Remington & Sons introduced the cartridge-firing Model 1875, the company entered the same large-frame market as Colt. Yet even within Model 1875 production, hammer details changed, and specialist research has identified early examples without the later safety notch. A rule that ignores production changes can be wrong even when the model name stays the same. Smith & Wesson offered another major alternative. The Model 3 was a single-action cartridge revolver with a top break frame. Opening it tipped the barrel and cylinder forward, and operated an extractor that could remove several empty cases together. Major George W. Schofield proposed changes for cavalry use, leading to the Schofield pattern adopted in 1875. It still held 6 cartridges, but its frame, loading system, latch, and hammer arrangement were not the same as the Colt. The difference mattered in service. A Colt cylinder stayed in the frame while cases were pushed out one at a time. A Schofield opened at the top and cleared its cylinder through the break action. The Army used both designs during the same broad period, which alone should make us suspicious of any claim that one loading rule covered every military revolver. So the useful spoken list is short: cap and ball Colt, cartridge Colt, Remington, and Smith & Wesson. 4 broad groups, several different systems, and many changes inside each group. Add small pocket revolvers that held 5 cartridges by design, and the phrase, "loaded 5", becomes even less precise. A man with a 5-chamber Smith & Wesson pocket revolver could load every chamber and still truthfully say he carried 5 shots. By 1887, Smith & Wesson was producing its safety hammerless revolver, a small double-action design with an internal hammer and a 5-shot cylinder. In 1892, the United States Army began replacing the old single-action .45 caliber service revolvers with the Colt Model 1892 double-action revolver in .38 caliber. The firearms world did not stand still while folklore waited for a clean rule. The practical choice depended on model, year, condition, training, and the owner's tolerance for risk. It also depended on what danger seemed most immediate. A cavalryman preparing for a campaign might value the sixth cartridge more than a ranch worker carrying a worn revolver through an uneventful week. Both choices can make sense inside their circumstances. Neither proves what everyone else did. The evidence for actual gunfighters is even messier, because different sources answer different questions. A military manual tells us intended procedure. A factory catalog tells us what a manufacturer claimed. A memoir tells us what one person remembered, often years later. A gunsmith's advice may reveal practical experience, but only if the date and wording can be verified. A surviving firearm tells us the model, serial range, alterations, wear, and sometimes ownership. A later gun writer may preserve an older practice, or may repeat something learned from another later writer. Reenactors add another layer. They often use careful modern procedures because they are responsible for crowds, borrowed firearms, and present-day safety standards. Their methods can demonstrate a mechanism very well. They cannot, by themselves, prove what a writer did in 1880. Newspapers can record accidents, trials, robberies, and public shootings, but routine carry rarely became news. A revolver that stayed safely in its holster all day produced no headline. That creates a basic evidence problem. The behavior being investigated was ordinary, private, and usually uneventful. Those are exactly the habits the historical record preserves worst. Museums are especially useful, and especially easy to misuse. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History holds examples of the Colt Single-Action Army, the Colt Model 1851 Navy, the Colt Model 1860 Army, and the Remington Model 1875. Those objects let curators compare frames, cylinders, loading systems, calibers, and manufacturing details. They do not provide a census of cartridges carried by cowboys in Dodge City, Kansas, or Deadwood, Dakota Territory. This is a form of survivor bias. The guns that reached museums are often famous, decorated, unusually well documented, or simply fortunate enough to survive. An ordinary revolver carried by an unknown ranch worker may have been worn out, traded, rebuilt, lost, or melted for scrap. The museum record preserves objects better than routines. Celebrity stories create another trap. Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Doc Holliday, and Wild Bill Hickok are frequently pulled into any discussion of Western firearms because their names are familiar. But ownership of a revolver does not prove the number of cartridges loaded in it. A photograph does not reveal the chamber under the hammer. Unless a reliable contemporary source records the practice, assigning 5-round carry to a specific celebrity is not history. It is decoration. The neat formula often repeated today says to load 1 cartridge, leave the next chamber empty, load 4 more, and then lower the hammer over the empty chamber. As a way to explain the final position of the cylinder, the formula is memorable. The problem is dating it. The surviving 19th century Army instructions instead describe loading cartridges and using the safety notch. Evidence that some experienced civilians chose the empty chamber is plausible. Evidence that the neat formula was universally taught across the Old West is not. 20th century gun culture helped make the story firmer than the records. Western films turned the Colt into a visual symbol. Actors drew, fired, spun, dropped, and reholstered revolvers under controlled production conditions, while audiences saw a simplified version of the gun. The equipment looked historically uniform, even when the real West had included old percussion Colts, cartridge conversions, Remingtons, Smith & Wessons, pocket revolvers, and imported designs. Gun magazines and safety instructors faced a real problem because old-style single actions remained in use, while many new owners understood the films better than the mechanism. A clear rule was easier to teach than a lecture about notch condition, production variations, and 19th century ordnance policy. Once repeated for several generations, a prudent modern instruction could sound older and more universal than the evidence allowed. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West now gives the direct modern recommendation for original Colt-type single actions. Carry 5 and place the hammer over the empty chamber. Former Cody Firearms Museum curator Ashley Holubinsky has explained the reason in plain terms. The firing pin is attached to the hammer, and with the hammer fully down over a live cartridge, a hard impact can reach the primer. That recommendation is responsible and mechanically sound. It still does not prove that every 19th century gunfighter followed it. Good safety practice can be older than the source that clearly records it, but historians cannot turn possibility into a percentage. There was no survey of cowboys, no cartridge count at every town gate, and no clerk following lawmen around with a notebook. The West produced paperwork, but not quite that much paperwork. Later technology shows why the old rule was design-specific. In 1973, Ruger replaced its earlier single-action system with new model revolvers using a transfer bar. The transfer bar rises into position when the trigger is pulled and carries the hammer's energy to the firing pin. With the trigger forward, the bar drops out of the path. A blow to the hammer no longer has the same direct route to a primer. Hammer blocks solve the problem in another way, by placing a barrier between the hammer and the firing pin or cartridge until the trigger is deliberately operated. These systems do not rewrite the history of the Colt single-action army. They show that manufacturers eventually built the desired protection into the mechanism instead of asking a small notch or an empty chamber to carry the whole burden. That brings the evidence back to the original trade-off. The Colt, adopted in 1873, held 6.45 caliber cartridges. The Army Manual, published in 1874, instructed soldiers to use the safety notch with the cylinder loaded. The Remington Model 1875 and the Smith & Wesson Schofield of the same decade had their own designs and cannot simply inherit every Colt warning. Earlier Colt Navy and Army percussion revolvers used positions between chambers. Later, Ruger new models used a transfer bar. For a traditional Colt-type single-action without a modern transfer bar, lowering the hammer over an empty chamber removes a real accidental discharge path. If the gun is dropped or the hammer is struck, there is no primer directly beneath the firing pin. That is the mechanical verdict, and it is not controversial. The historical verdict needs more restraint. Some armed people almost certainly chose the empty chamber because the logic was available to anyone who understood the parts. Others followed the official safety notch method. Some probably made careless choices. Some carried different revolvers where the question worked differently. No surviving evidence supports the claim that all cowboys or all gunfighters loaded 5, and no honest source can give a reliable percentage. Giving up one cartridge was not mainly about losing a gunfight. Most revolvers spent nearly all their working lives being carried, bumped, sweated on, stored, cleaned, and carried again. The dangerous shooting that made legends occupied very little time. The ordinary hours created the safety problem. 5 cartridges made sense because one empty chamber could reduce a real hazard in a traditional Colt-type revolver. The empty chamber tells us less about gunfighting than it does about all the long hours when the revolver had to remain loaded without firing.